guys. All right. It is Ryan, the social worker here at thinkeastservice, or thinkeastservice here at studio apartments at Think East. I put together a quick PowerPoint on trauma and just a very basic overview. While I'm pulling up the screen, I do want to share that trauma is one of those issues that's very near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of work in this field over the last 15 years or so. And I'm going to try really, really hard not to kind of go off on tangents and talk your ear off. This is an area that I am very, very passionate about, and I know a lot about. And so I always find that I have way more to say than, the 5 or 6 slides that we put together for these little brief overviews for you guys. Okay, so what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional reaction to an event or a series of events. So an event, a single event, I think the best example is a car accident. Either experience, like being in the car accident as the driver or as a passenger or as a witness. An example that was given to me while I was in grad school was this older woman who came upon the scene of an accident, called 911, and then ran over to the cars in an attempt to help whoever might have been injured. And what she witnessed was a pretty severe injury, and that, like, experiencing that was a traumatic experience for her. A series of events. The 2 best examples I've been able to come up with are chronic trauma, like child abuse. As a child or a child experiencing pretty severe emotional, physical abuse or neglect. That is a series of events. That is not a one-time event. Domestic violence can also be a series of events if you are in a relationship that has been abusive over a period of time. That is what a series of events means. And it's not just an emotional reaction. So it's not just being depressed or being anxious or being withdrawn. It's also a neurological reaction. There's stuff going on inside of your brain and with your parasympathetic and your sympathetic neurological systems. That is where the hypervigilance comes from. Just being jumpy, right? Like, a car backfires and you're jumping because you have experienced gun violence, or you've seen it, or know somebody who has experienced it. Children in particular who experience abuse or neglect, it changes the way their brain develops. It does. It changes the neurological pathways. It can change the size of parts of the brain. It can have pretty damaging impacts. These tend to be more related to chronic trauma for kids, not one-off, not single events, right? So if a child loses a parent, kind of one of the single greatest protective factors, which is something I will be talking about at a later time, is how responsive and receptive that other parent or another caregiver is in caring for them and meeting their needs. Right. So if mom passes away and dad steps up, right, dad does the thing. He's there, he listens, he's responsive, he's nurturing, he's caring, he's supportive. He makes sure his, child goes to school, child's in therapy. The child has the supports that he needs. When the child needs to talk, dad's there, dad's listening, he's paying attention to what is being said. That is vital, right? However, if a child comes to you and says, this person at school is bullying me and I don't feel safe there, and the parent is just like, well, you need to suck it up because that's what it is, and doesn't go and talk to the school or anything like that, the parent's response can make worse that traumatic event that the kids are experiencing. Traumatic events are perceived differently. They're experienced differently by everybody there, right? So 2 kids growing up in the exact same house, they could be identical twins, for crying out loud, growing up in exactly the same house. They experience, let's say, a tornado comes. We just had tornadoes here in Austin and Round Rock not that long ago. One twin may be fine, right? May have gotten up the next day, talked about it, cried a little bit, been a little bit afraid, but was okay, right? Was able to kind of move on with their day and their lives. And the other one gets stuck, right? That moment was so scary for them that they are experiencing some post-traumatic stress. And I think that's super, super important to just think about, because so often with siblings, In particular, like as adults, you know, you'll hear, well, I went through the same thing. I don't understand why they're struggling with it and I'm not, right? Why is this a big deal for them, right? Like it's been gone, they need to get over it. And that's hard for the other sibling to hear. Well, in some circumstances, I guess that might be true. I think that it is hard for you as an individual to know explicitly, to know every aspect of how your sibling or how your partner or how your child is experiencing something. You don't know what other stuff is going on in their lives. You don't know where they were emotionally in that moment. You don't know if it was closer to like your brother's birthday when the tornado, that twin's birthday when that tornado happened. And like their birthday was like a day that was very special to them, and now it's being kind of wrapped up in this trauma, this traumatic event that happened. You have no idea, right? And so my advice for everybody is, when somebody comes to you and says, this is really hard for me, right? This was really hard, right? I don't want to go back home because this is hard for me because of X, Y, or Z, right? Because of, you know, how mom talked to me when we were kids. You know, to validate that, to offer them a little bit of, yeah, that like I can understand why that would be hard, even though it's not hard for me. Or, you know, even though I never thought of it that way, right? Something as simple as, I never thought of it that way. I never thought that it could be hard for you because of that. I'm sorry you've been going through that. And trauma is complicated. It's just a complicated topic. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of research right now going on with just how trauma impacts your body neurologically and brain development, and how, depending on where you are in your life cycle, right? If you are 3 years old and you've experienced major trauma versus 13 years old versus 23 versus 75, right? Like where you are in your life cycle experiencing that trauma can change how that trauma impacts both your life and your physically, right? How it can impact you physically. Right. So there's a whole bunch of research there. There's a whole bunch of research on the social stuff, on how trauma can impact your day-to-day interactions with your peers and your neighbors and your family members. There's way too much to cover in a 15-20 minute presentation, just an infinite amount that I just can't. I don't know that anybody could, right? Like we could have a whole series. Like I took an entire class on trauma and on trauma interventions, and they still didn't cover it all. And there are a lot of resources out there to help you identify any traumatic experiences you may have had and how they've impacted your lives. This one I think is fascinating. Young kids in particular, right before the age of like 4, sometimes experience traumatic events or child abuse, like neglect or abuse. And we think as adults, okay, well, they're not going to remember it. It's not that big of a deal. But sometimes it is, right? Like I said, those early experiences, they impact the way our brain develops. And so now it's 30 years later, you're 33 years old, and you're just really reactive, right? You're finding yourself like really angry at people for what seems to be very small reasons, or you find yourself just inherently feeling unsafe, right? You have kids now. You don't want your kids to be with anybody except for you. There could be some background, there could be some trauma history, some trauma, it could be a trauma response that your body has remembered, even though you explicitly do not have a memory of the event happening. And so, you know, it's worth having a conversation with a counselor, with a trauma-informed counselor, to think through that, right? How might you be impacted by your past in ways that you haven't even thought through? And healing is a journey. And I think put that at the bottom of on a slide in every single one of these that I have done. Healing is a journey, right? Just because, you know, you're having this eureka moment where you're like, oh my gosh, like this is a trauma response. I don't like to walk by myself because of this thing that happened to my friend when I was in college, right? I'm responding to that now. Well, there's power in that. There's power in recognition. That anxiety and the way that event is impacting your life is going to change over time, right? There may be moments where you feel perfectly confident, and then there are going to be moments where that experience rears its ugly head again, right? If you are extra tired, if you are very stressed out, your body is going to be less able to cope with some of those responses that you might just be innately having. And so just be kind to yourself on your healing journey. As always, be kind. Recognize the small things that you do, right? I don't know if you watch the how to set goals effectively video that I did, but on that I talk a lot about celebrating the small steps, right? Celebrating those moments where just a tiny step has happened, right? Because the big steps don't happen without all the small steps. And so I encourage all of you to continue to be kind to yourself and to see that healing journey you may go on. And to give yourself credit where credit is due, because this is hard stuff we're doing here, hard stuff we're talking about. There are different types of trauma. I'm very briefly going over the next couple of slides. I just want to introduce you guys to the concepts. There's acute trauma, single event, car crash, tornado. There's chronic trauma. And this can be, this can be child abuse. This can be domestic violence. This can be health conditions, can be trauma, it can be chronic, can end up being perceived as chronic trauma. If you were diagnosed with something as a child, and you don't really understand why you have to go to the doctor so much, right? You can develop a trauma response to that. Complex trauma, this is just a lot of it. This is exposure to chronic trauma and how that has impacted you. This can also be complex trauma, can also be when there's multiple traumatic events ongoing, right? So if you experienced child abuse, physical abuse as a kid, and then you were removed by CPS, and then, maybe in your foster home, there was like bullying going on, that was traumatic. And then you're removed again. Every time you're removed, that's a traumatic event. And even going back home can be a traumatic event, right? Because you've gone through a whole wide range, potentially at that point, of different family cultures that you're trying to deal with, right? You're trying to figure out what the rules are and who you get to be in that space. Complex trauma is it's complex, it's hard to deal with, it's hard work. System-induced trauma, I've seen this, and I saw several of these kind of graphics while I was looking for it the other day, and I wanted to make sure that we were discussing system-induced or historical trauma. If you are a person of color, you are well aware that the system has failed you, your family, your ancestors. They have actively targeted you, your family, your ancestors, your communities. This it needs to be discussed, and that is trauma. It is a traumatic event. Native Americans refer to it as soul wounds, intergenerational trauma, where you are being impacted by the same kinds of traumatic events that your parents are being impacted, and that your grandparents and your great grandparents are being impacted by. On this particular slide, it also talks about the traumatic removal from a home, right? Going into the justice system, having to go into a psychiatric facility, because you are actively suicidal, without wanting to. And then there's vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is it's something that is talked a lot about with caregivers, caretakers, social workers, therapists, a daughter who's taking care of her elderly parents, right? Being in a space where you were hearing about somebody's trauma over and over again, or different kinds of trauma, you end up taking some of that trauma on, right? And so you may start experiencing trauma due to that. Like you are experiencing trauma, but you may be taking that on, and it may become something that is harder and harder to cope with over time. If you are experiencing any of these, if you have experienced any of these and you would like to talk more about it, or you would like referrals for additional resources, please reach out. Please don't hesitate. My email is thinkeastservice@gmail.com. Please reach out. Please make that known, and we will make the referrals as needed. Okay. Some common reactions to trauma. These are not the only reactions. This is just the simplest list that I found. And I wanted a simple list because it is easy to sit and spend all day talking about how people are impacted by trauma and how trauma continues to impact their lives. So I'm going to go through some of the, I'm just going to touch on them, right? I'm not going to sit here and in detail talk about each of these. But denial, confusion, anger, fear, anxiety, depression, flashbacks, having a hard time concentrating or remembering, withdrawing from the people around you, having trouble sleeping, feeling extra tired, your body feels more tense, right? And maybe because your body is physically more tense, headaches, chest pain, unexplained pain, additional health problems. All of these are reactions to trauma and to traumatic events. If you're experiencing these, especially if you're experiencing several of these, please reach out. We can get you guys referrals to local community partners. On the next slide, I think it's the next slide, I put some phone numbers that you can also call 24/7. Okay. Oh, definitely not the next slide. Slide after this. Okay, some additional symptoms of trauma, nightmares, flashback. And I love that this one is handwritten. That's why I put this one on here. It is handwritten. And there's something about it that feels so tactile. It feels so connected to what we're talking about here, because trauma is very, like, it's a very emotional, very physical thing. It lives in your body. But panic attacks, having a mistrust, having trouble trusting people can be symptoms of trauma. Feeling hopeless, shame, irritability, loss of interest, self-destructive behavior. If a lot of people who drink a lot of alcohol or who engage in drug use, right, substance use, they can be self-medicating. They can be trying to forget an experience, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, and more. So please take a look at this. Please think this through. Once again, if you're experiencing any of this and you would like help with referrals, please reach out. Okay. A couple of resources that I wanted to put on here: the Safe Alliance hotline and ETCIC, that's Austin, Travis County Integral Care. Both of these hotlines are 24 hours a day. Safe Alliance does deal more with domestic violence and inter-partner violence, but intimate partner, oh my gosh, intimate partner violence. That's not all that they deal with. But if you're feeling unsafe or you need someone to talk to, like, that is a place to start. And if they are unable to assist and help you, they will refer you. They will let you know some other options. And if they don't, I certainly can. And then ATCIC, if you are having suicidal ideation, if you are having homicidal ideation, if you are feeling out of control, if you are feeling very depressed, if you're feeling very anxious, if you are feeling more irritable than usual for a long period of time, that phone number you can call 24 hours a day as well. Okay. And they will try to get someone to you. And in an absolute worst case scenario, if you are feeling suicidal, like you are wanting to hurt somebody or yourself, you can always call 311 or 911 and you can ask them for a mental health response. You can tell them you're trying to get a vet, you're trying to get in somewhere where you are safe. You also in these moments of crisis, you can also call your family and friends. But a lot of times, family and friends can't guarantee your safety. So some things to think about, some things to think through. The Safe Alliance and ATCIC, you can call at any time. You do not have to wait until you're in a state of crisis. You can just call and say, hey, I've been struggling lately. Can you help? Especially ATCIC. And there are plenty of local counselors and local group therapies that are doing all kinds of really interesting stuff to help people process through their trauma. You'll see art therapy stuff now. You're seeing local like D&D groups using role play in order to process through trauma. Okay. And I can help link you and connect you guys to those resources. These are the references. These are the websites that I pulled the graphics from for today's presentation. They seem to be reasonable references. There are also more. So reach out to me if you have any additional questions or comments or concerns, or this is, something just listening through, you're like, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is something to think through. Happy to walk you through the process. Happy to listen if that's all you want. If you just want somebody to listen, a little bit to kind of what you're experiencing and what you're going through, I'm always happy to do that. I am a licensed social worker, so it is confidential, okay? But information is not being shared with outside parties. All right, I wanted to say thank you very much for tuning in and for listening to what I have to say. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, leave a comment, email me, send me a text message, and I would love to follow up with you guys. All right, have a good day, have a good weekend.